Welcome to another deep dive. This time, we're tackling a topic that I think will really resonate with you, especially given your love for languages. We're going to be exploring the idea of thinking in English.
Oh, that's a good one. When I first heard about this whole thinking in a new language thing, I have to admit I was a little skeptical. It just sounded, well, kind of impossible. Like, how do you just make your brain switch over like that?
Yeah.
But, the more I looked into it, the more I realized it's not so much about flipping a switch as it is about, rewiring.
Rewiring. Okay. Now that sounds a bit intense.
Yeah, it can feel that way at first,
Yeah.
but it's really more of a gradual process. Think about it. When you were learning your first language, you didn't start with, like, grammar rules or vocabulary lists.
No, definitely not.
Right.
Yeah.
You just sort of absorbed it, through constant exposure. And that's what thinking in English is all about. It's like recreating that immersive environment, even if you're not living in, say, London or New York.
So, what's the big payoff here? Why bother rewiring our brains to think in English? Does it really make that much of a difference?
Oh, a huge difference. For starters, think about fluency. When you can think directly in English, you don't have to go through that mental translation step. The words just flow. You know what I mean?
I'm starting to. It sounds like it would make conversations so much smoother.
Exactly. And more natural, too. No more of those awkward pauses while you're trying to remember how to say, toaster in English.
I think we've all been there. But okay, fluency is one thing, but does thinking in English actually make us more confident speakers?
Absolutely. When you can think and speak in English without that constant self-doubt, you just naturally feel more confident in your abilities.
Okay, that makes sense. Less worrying about making mistakes, more focus on actually using the language.
Exactly. And there's a cognitive benefit, too. Think about it. Constantly translating back and forth can be mentally exhausting. But when you think in English, you free up all that mental energy.
It's like you can finally shift out of autopilot and really engage with the language and the people you're talking to.
I like that analogy. And here's where it gets even more interesting. As you start thinking in English more and more, your brain basically turns into this, like, language learning machine.
Hmm.
You start noticing English everywhere, in music, in movies, just in everyday conversations.
Wow, so your brain is basically doing the work for you, even when you're not actively studying.
Exactly. That constant exposure helps you really internalize the language. But of course, there are challenges. Like any new skill, retraining your brain takes effort and consistency.
Right, it's not going to happen overnight.
Yeah.
So where do we even begin? Are we talking like meditation in English or something?
Uh-huh. No, not quite. It can be as simple as starting with like 5 minutes a day. One technique that's super effective is labeling.
Labeling.
Yeah. You look around your environment and just mentally label things in English.
So I just walk around my house thinking chair, table, lamp. Seems almost too easy.
I know, right? But it's all about repetition. Trust me, it works. And you can do it anywhere. Waiting in line at the store. Start labeling.
Okay, I can see how those little things can start to add up.
They really do. And once you're comfortable with labeling, you can try self-talk.
Self-talk, like talking to myself in English.
Exactly. Think of it as giving your inner monologue an English accent. I know it sounds a little weird.
Well, actually, I sometimes catch myself doing that already when I'm trying to work through a problem or something.
There you go.
Hmm.
See, you're already on your way. And the more you do it, the more natural it will become. You'll be surprised how quickly your brain adapts.
This is pretty encouraging, actually. So we've got labeling, self-talk. Any other tricks we can add to our mental toolkit?
Well, how about narrating your day? Just mentally describe what you're doing as you go through your routine, but in English.
So, like, instead of I'm making coffee, it's am making coffee.
You got it. Subtle, but powerful. It reinforces the grammar and, well, just gets you thinking in those English sentence structures.
It's like sneaking in a little extra practice without even really trying. Okay, I like it. But I have a feeling you've got more up your sleeve, right?
Oh, yeah. Let's talk about thinking in Q&A.
Q&A.
Yep, asking yourself questions in English and then answering them also in English, like a little internal interview.
So instead of just thinking I'm hungry, I could ask myself, what am I in the mood for today? And then answer, I think I'd really love a big salad. Something like that.
Exactly. And try to ask yourself open-ended questions that require more than just a yes or no. Really get your brain working in English.
That's a good point. It's not just about vocabulary. It's about actually using English to process your thoughts.
You're getting it. And the more you challenge yourself, the stronger those neural pathways become. Okay, so we've covered labeling, self-talk, narrating our day, and Q&A. Ready for one more?
Get me with it.
This one's a bit more challenging. Dedicate specific blocks of time to thinking only in English, like a total immersion experience.
Okay, that sounds intense. Any tips for making that work? I feel like my brain might try to rebel.
Start small, maybe 5 or 10 minutes, and gradually increase it. Choose an activity that requires some focus, but not so much that it distracts you from thinking in English.
So something like reading a short article or maybe planning out my day, but all in English.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to use technology to help you out. There are tons of apps and websites that can create that immersive English environment.
Okay, this is a lot to take in, and I'm sure our listener is eager to start putting some of these techniques into practice. But before we move on, I just want to emphasize one thing. Be patient with yourself. Don't expect to be fluent overnight. Okay, welcome back. I don't know about you, but my brain is definitely feeling a little bit rewired after all that,
Yep.
but in a good way.
I know, right? It's pretty amazing to think that we can actually train our brains to think in a whole new language.
It really is. And speaking of amazing things, you were about to share something about dreams.
Yeah. Have you ever heard of people having dreams in another language?
Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. I have a friend who's fluent in Spanish, and she told me that, like, a few years in, she started dreaming in Spanish. She said it felt like a big moment, like she really felt like she'd reached a new level.
Exactly. And it's not just a coincidence. It actually shows that your brain is processing the language on this, like, deeper level,
Mm.
almost subconsciously.
So does that mean if I start dreaming in English, I've basically cracked the code?
Well, it's definitely a good sign. It means you're moving beyond just memorizing words and grammar, and you're starting to really integrate English into your thought patterns.
So it's less about reaching some kind of end goal and more about, like, enjoying the journey.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's all about progress, not perfection. Every time you catch yourself thinking in English without even trying, that's a win. You should celebrate those moments.
It's like, when you're first learning to ride a bike without training wheels, you might still wobble a bit, but hey, you're doing it.
Uh-huh. I love that. And, speaking of analogies, I just want to push back a little on something you said earlier. You mentioned thinking in English being like taking your brain off autopilot. I actually think it's more like creating a new autopilot system, one that's specifically designed for English.
I see what you mean. So it's not about erasing our first language, but about, like, building this parallel system that can run alongside it.
Exactly. And as you practice and immerse yourself in English, that new system becomes more and more efficient, more intuitive. You can switch back and forth between languages almost effortlessly.
Okay, so say I do manage to create this English autopilot. Does that mean I'm also unlocking this, like, whole new cultural perspective? Because I know our source material mentioned something about experiencing the world in a different way through thinking in English.
Oh, absolutely. It goes way beyond just the language itself. When you start thinking in English, you're tapping into the cultural nuances, the humor, those unspoken rules that shape how native speakers interact with the world.
Okay, can you give me a specific example of what you mean?
Sure. Let's take humor, for example. Humor is often very tied to cultural references and wordplay. When you're translating jokes in your head, you might miss those subtle things that make them funny. But when you think in English, you can get the joke on a more instinctive level.
It's like you need to be speaking the language of the culture to really get the joke.
Exactly. And it's not just about humor. It's about understanding those social cues, idioms, those unwritten cultural norms. You're not just learning words, you're learning how to think like an English speaker.
It sounds like you're almost developing a new cultural identity, even if you haven't physically moved to, an English-speaking country.
You're right. It really does broaden your horizons and open you up to new ways of seeing the world. And there's another benefit we haven't talked about yet, which I think you'll especially appreciate.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What is it?
There's a lot of research out there suggesting that being bilingual, and I think thinking in another language plays a big part in this, can actually boost your creativity.
Really? How so?
Well, when you're constantly switching between languages, your brain is working harder. It's making new connections, thinking outside the box. And that mental flexibility can translate into more creativity in all sorts of areas, like problem solving, brainstorming, even artistic expression.
Wow, so thinking in English isn't just about learning the language. It's about, like, unlocking a new level of creative potential.
Exactly. It's like adding new colors to your palette, new instruments to your orchestra. You're not just learning English, you're expanding your mind.
That is amazing. So we've talked a lot about the amazing benefits of thinking in English, but let's be real, it can be challenging, especially at first. How can we make this whole process a little easier, a little more fun?
Well, one technique that I find really helpful is role playing. Imagine yourself in different situations and just practice those conversations in English, even if it's just in your head.
Ah, so like a mental dress rehearsal for real life interactions.
Exactly. And you can create those scenarios based on your own interest. Like if you love to travel, you could practice ordering food at a restaurant, asking for directions, things like that.
And if you're more career-minded, you could practice giving presentations, leading meetings, just having those everyday conversations with colleagues, all in English.
Exactly. The possibilities are endless.
Hmm.
And the great thing about role playing is that it's low pressure. You can make mistakes, experiment, and just figure out what feels natural for you.
It's like a mental playground for language learning. You can have fun with it.
Exactly. And that sense of fun is so important. When you approach language learning with curiosity and a sense of adventure, the challenges just seem less daunting.
I definitely know what you mean. This whole conversation has been so eye-opening. It's really not just about learning English, it's about expanding your mind, your perspective. But before we get too carried away, I think it's time to bring us back down to earth and wrap up this part of our deep dive. Okay, we're back for the final part of our deep dive into thinking in English. And wow, we've covered so much ground. We've talked about the cognitive benefits, the cultural implications, even how it could potentially boost our creativity. It's pretty mind-blowing stuff. But
Yeah.
I'm curious, where do we go from here? How do we actually take all this amazing information and make it stick, make it a part of our daily lives?
Yeah, that's the big question, right? It's one thing to understand the concept, but how do we put it into practice and actually make those lasting changes?
You know what I think? I think the key is to approach it less like a chore or a task and more like an experiment, an ongoing journey, like a
Yeah.
self-discovery thing.
I like that. It takes the pressure off. Like
Yeah.
you don't have to be perfect at it right away. Exactly. It's about embracing the whole process, the ups and downs, even the inevitable slip-ups.
Yeah.
Because, hey, even native English speakers make mistakes.
That's true. So instead of getting discouraged when we mess up, we should see those moments as like learning opportunities.
Exactly. And I think it's also really important to find ways to, well, just make the process fun. Because if you're constantly forcing yourself to think in English, it's going to feel like a chore.
Yeah.
But if you can find ways to weave it into activities you already enjoy, then it's going to be a lot more sustainable.
I see what you mean. So like if I love listening to music, maybe I could try focusing on the lyrics more. Maybe even try singing along in English, even if it's just in my head.
Exactly. Or let's say you love cooking. You could try following recipes in English, or even try creating your own recipes and writing them down in English.
It's about finding those like natural opportunities to engage with the language, make it feel authentic, not forced.
Yes, exactly. And as you start making those small changes, I think you'll gradually start to notice a shift. You'll find yourself thinking in English more spontaneously without even realizing it.
Yeah, it's like, when you finally master a new skill, like driving a car, at first you're thinking about every little step, but then at some point it just clicks and becomes second nature.
Yes, exactly like that. And that's when the real magic happens. You're not translating anymore, you're thinking and reacting in real time. And that's what unlocks that next level of fluency and confidence.
Wow. It's like you've crossed this threshold and you're suddenly able to experience the world through this whole new lens, a lens that's shaped by the richness and nuance of the English language.
That's a beautiful way to put it.
Yeah.
And as you continue to immerse yourself in the language, that lens becomes even clearer. It allows you to see the world in ways you never could have imagined before.
It's almost like you're developing a new sense, a new way of perceiving and understanding the world around you. And it goes beyond just understanding the words themselves. It's about understanding the culture behind them, the humor, the way people think and interact. It's fascinating.
It really is. It's a holistic experience, one that engages your mind, your emotions, your whole sense of who you are.
And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up our deep dive. So, as we bring this episode to a close, what's the one key takeaway you want our listeners to walk away with today?
Let me see. I think it's this. Thinking in English is not just about, mastering a language. It's about unlocking a new way of experiencing the world. It's about expanding your horizons, challenging your assumptions, opening yourself up to new possibilities. And it all starts with that first step, that first conscious effort to think in English, even if it's just for a few minutes each day.
Beautifully said. And to all our listeners out there, I hope this deep dive has inspired you to take that first step, embrace the challenge, and embark on this incredible journey. Because who knows, you might just start dreaming in English soon.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep thinking in English.